because I'll also include some stuff in here. So, okay, so that's us right there. This is week 4 already. We've been in class for over 3 weeks now. Isn't that crazy? Is that like, yeah. I'm still struggling to remember some of your names. I'm just joking. I know. So today is a sort of a combination work day and mini lecture. But more importantly, today's the last day we have in class before the project's due. How do you feel about that? You got one thumbs up and a bunch of grins. How many of you feel like you're on track or just a little behind where you'd like to be right now?
A little behind.
Just a little behind is a healthy. This feels like this sentence is going somewhere. Feeling like you're a little behind is a little bit like that kind of is enough to keep you like motivated, right? If you're feeling like, oh my goodness, I just started, like that means you probably are panicking a little bit. But it feels like the group meetings, people hopping around and meeting with their groups has been helpful in keeping you on track. I'm putting a question mark at the end of that. Do you agree?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay.
What was the question?
Meeting with groups is like kind of keeping you like feeling on track a little bit more, kind of keeping you from falling behind as much.
Yes.
He's fine.
I'm fine.
And Parker's fine. Happy birthday, Parker.
Thank you.
How old are you today?
Huh?
How old are you?
That's such a...
Well, look,
Three.
birthday.
It changes every year.
Old man Parker.
Old man party.
Is that? Y'all are too young to be insulted by
I
someone
got
asking you
hair
how old
growing
you
in my
are.
ears now.
So hopefully we still I don't want you to. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of talk briefly about some stuff. One, like this is a stressful major, right? And it's become very evident over the last few semesters how stressful, or how much stress takes its toll on our students, at least. I'm really trying to be conscious of not causing you all to have like emotional breakdowns, right? And so like I've scaled back projects, I've made changes to projects. Hopefully, really I've eliminated like 4 exercises from this class, and in exchange for that, kind of done the homework option, hoping that will keep you like from feeling that stress. It'll keep you feeling like I'm on track or I'm falling a little behind, I need to catch up a little bit. But never feeling like I'm completely lost, right? Anything I can do to make that better, let me know. If you feel like the timelines are too crunched, or you're feeling like we're trying to turn around to a certain deadline too quickly, like however we can scale that, that's important. Having said that, stuff's still going to get stressful, and so I know there's flyers hanging up for it all over the place, but it's worth having that reminder. That the Let's Talks are still going on over in the Millennium Center. So for any reason, like you're arguing with your roommate, you're just feeling down, whatever, that's just sort of an open walk-in session where you can go talk to people and just it's a counselor, but it's not. There's no paperwork involved. Like you just walk in, sit down, and start chatting with them. It's not like you're gonna bill your health insurance or something like that for it. And so like sometimes that's nice to just have somebody to chat with about that. So, but as we go along, like really my goal this semester is to make sure that this class starts to feel more balanced, and I never feel like that you're dreading having to come in here because you're behind on stuff. So however we can make that better for you, any ideas you have, please let me know. All right, so but I do like looking at the schedule here just to see like we are on track for next class period. And we're going to have a full critique. So we got a relatively long class time, so we probably won't have too much of an issue with that. But we're going to come in, drop them in the folder, scoot to the front of the room. We're going to watch through them and give everybody sort of one more feedback session, right? Of where it is, where they feel like it is a final piece, right? All right. So kind of building up to that, that means everybody in the room is probably you're at least on the home stretch, right? You just rounded third base, and you have a good idea of the outlook of getting to the end of it, right? Like getting to home base. And so that means like right now is where we would kind of start structuring our plan on how to wrap this up. I've kind of skipped over some parts of this throughout the semester, but what I'd like to do is just kind of go through how I end up tying down the shot that I've been working on throughout this whole thing, the little girl doing the backflip. So first things first is I occasionally you'll just stop and look at it and be like, oh, there's some issues I need to fix on this, right? And so this is me fixing like some small little things that I was unhappy with. So some of it was how she comes into frame, sort of the length of her stride and stuff like that to make this feel a little bit more like she's running at the right speed. If you remember from the previous one, it felt like she sort of like slowed down at the beginning of it and then shot forward. And so it's more to just kind of keep that pacing feeling correct. So all this is me going through and kind of reassessing it, right? I've done the polish pass all the way through the spine. I don't think I've done the arms yet at this point. And this is like, now that it's at that point, I can look at it again and be like, is this feeling right? I think that that's an important stage of this, is to periodically sort of scoot away from it and try to look at it with as fresh eyes as possible. Now, have I shown you all how to flip a video?
Yes,
okay.
You might want to do that again.
Okay. Actually, we'll do it right after this video's over. So again, some of this stuff is me just kind of fixing little things. Also, you'll notice a little wobble on her hips right there. I think I had to do. Okay, maybe. So to flip a video, you have to open it in VLC. So I'll right-click on this, open with VLC Media Player. Okay. So it's under Video, and I'm sorry, no, it's not. It's under Tools, Effects and Filters, and then it's a Video Effect, and it's a geometry effect, meaning we're changing the actual shape of the video. And then we just have to turn on this transform and choose one of these drop-down lists, right? So if we flip it horizontally, it will mirror it, and we'll get to see the video with fresh eyes, right? We'll get to see it from a different perspective. This really changes stuff. Like, you maybe have been animating on this so long that it looks correct to you. And when you flip it, you'll realize, wow, my character's neck looks broken through the entire animation. The entire thing is wrong, right? And all I have to do is rotate that a little bit to fix it. But if you stare at it for so long, it will start to feel right even when it's wrong. Anybody do this with illustration? It's a good way to flip an illustration. And you'll see the weirdest things. You'll be like, well, I thought my character's head was the right shape, but when I flipped it, now the character's head is all weird shaped, right? And it's so easy, it's such an easy trick to help you see it with some fresh eyes, that it's I don't want to, you don't want to do it too much, because then you'll kind of become desensitized to it, and you'll start to think of it as two different animations, and you'll start to see, but if you do it periodically every couple hours or something, it'll really help you with some stuff. So, I sort of stopped at this point. I did fix errors pass, right? Where I fixed some of the way the character was moving in. There's also another thing that you will start to become sort of blinded to, and that is timing, right? Anybody ever animated a shot and you're like, this feels right, and then you look at it like 3 months later, go back and look at some of your stuff from Principles. You're like, why is that so slow, right? Well, if you sit there and stare at that for 6 hours, it will stop looking too slow. It will. Your mind will start adapting to it and saying, okay, that looks fine, right? It doesn't. And so what we need to be able to do, sorry, my audio is a little loud on this recording. What we need to be able to do is set aside some time to make a critical timing pass, right? Like, how can we improve the timing just in this last pass, right? And you can change the timing all the way up to the very end if you have to, but just like one hard look at timing really does help, right? The other thing is like timing sometimes feels like it's an element of everything else, and you may be thinking about timing, but really just think only about timing in this pass. Look at it and say, like, don't be thinking about the arcs, don't be thinking of anything else, just how is the timing? Now, there are a couple of tools we can use to do this. How many of you have used the retiming tool before? Anybody? Okay. We can do it in here, but what I've done is I've selected all the curves, and you'll see this little icon right here. It's like these three little sticks hanging down right next to the word stats. So watch what I do. Basically, I use that retiming tool, and I click at the first and the end of it, right? And this would allow me to scale the entire thing, but I can grab those little yellow segments, and I can slide sections of this around to retime it, right? Now, I know that I have some free timing that I got from my reference, but again, reference is our base, right? And like with everything, like we exaggerated the poses, we can also exaggerate the timing. And so you're seeing what I'm doing is I'm inserting these little areas and scaling and pushing and pulling parts of my timing to speed certain sections up, slow other sections down. I will say the retiming tool doesn't work well on every rig. Some rigs, you'll double click that retiming tool and MyL just freeze on it. It's like, nope, we're not doing this. In that case, you can retime just in the timeline, right? You can just select sections of keys and slide them around. The retiming tool is just sort of a nice way of sort of getting that. Once you're done retiming, you have to snap your keyframes to whole frames. So you right-click on your timeline and say snap to whole frames. My 2020 has an option that will auto-snap those. Still, it's worth making sure that everything is on a whole keyframe, right? The reason for that is if you have a keyframe on frame 25 and a half, it's going to look like it's on frame 25. And you're going to go to frame 25 and try to fix that keyframe, and you're going to be creating a completely new keyframe, not editing the one on 25 and a half, right? And so then you end up with double keyframes on frame 25, and stuff just starts getting messy, right? So snapping those keyframes, hopefully everybody's pretty familiar with that already. Okay, at this point, I retimed it. Retiming it broke a few things. It wasn't anything major, but it broke a couple of little things, such as, like, see how that curve wasn't, so in the past my curve was a little smoother. Retiming it kind of changed the pace at which that changes. And so I just had to go through and add a couple of little changes to the way my curves continued to flow in order to get that timing back. Or in order to get my polish back. So I think it's, again, interesting to realize that I have yet to do any splining on the arms at this point. That for me comes a little later than you might think. So that's where I'm doing here, hopping into splining the arms. My character is in FK. It's popped up a few times from working with a few of you that there's a reason IK exists, right? Like it's everybody works differently. I work in FK most of the time, unless I need my character's arms to be locked in place, right? If you need your character's arm to stop on something and stay there, it's almost impossible to do that in FK, right? It's really painful to try it. And so you may be animating a transition in there where your character's arms are in IK half the time, they're in IK the other half of the time. That's completely okay to do that. The transition is sort of the hard part. How do you transition from FK to IK? The other thing is, I'm not you, you're not me, right? I like working in FK whenever I can, But some people don't. Some people never want to animate an FK ever. It's not that one is intrinsically better than the other. FK, you get automatic arcs, and it's a little easier to use offsetting in order to get some overlapping action. Right? IK is way quicker to pose. You can pose an arm in IK really quickly. And I know professional animators, animation leads, who work exclusively in IK. And those people are like all across the gamut. I know people who worked at DreamWorks who worked exclusively in IK. One of the lead animators for Gearbox works exclusively in IK. And some of that is just sort of how you work. The issue is if you're going to work in IK and you're not locking your hand to things for your arms, you have to kind of make the arcs happen, right? The arcs are, IK is going to animate in a straight line, and you have to sort of create arcs with that. So what I'm doing in this video, though, as you watch it, is basically the same things I did up the spine, right? I'm going down the arms, and I'm making sure every one of those arm curves is clean, right? I'm using it to sort of adjust the transitions to everything, and at times using it to clarify the silhouettes and poses. But I'm also thinking in terms of what we talked about in overlapping action in the last class, right? Drag, lead and follow, all of those things. And I'm making small changes to the arm as a system to make that feel correct. Now in a few minutes here, you'll see that I probably start offsetting some stuff. So I went down one arm, now I'm doing the other arm. The other arm is sort of in the foreground, or in the background, so you don't see it as much. So it's got a little less polish on it. I spend a little less time on it. But I am clarifying some stuff here on these poses. There we go. And so this is splining. So I've splined all the way down the arm, doing the elbow now. This is an important note that you may all want to kind of be thinking about. Your elbow only bends in one axis. So if you look at how your anatomy works, right? I can only bend my elbow like this, right? If I want to bend it forward, I have to rotate at my shoulder, right? And I also kind of rotate a little bit of this ulna or whatever this is called here, in order to point my elbow backward, right? And then my elbow can bend like this, but your elbow only rotates in one axis. And on most rigs, that's the y-axis. So you'll see when I was polishing the elbow curve, the only curve that has any data on it is the y-axis. You should probably be careful about that because some rigs will let you rotate in all three axes. The thing about that is they're doing that so you have the ability to break the rig if you need to. Like if you want to make like a smear frame or something by breaking the rig in a way it's not supposed to move, you have the ability to do that. The problem with that is some people will start bending the elbow in the wrong direction from the very beginning, and so you kind of have to sort of figure out what is the right direction for the elbow to bend. As I continue along, now I'm down to the hand and just sort of polishing the curves on the hand. Yeah. And you'll see that some of this is not me doing everything in the graph editor. Some of this is me going in and putting a little bit of extra posing on this to make it work better. And then I play blasted it out. Okay. So I would also like to look sort of at the timing of this right now. We're at 10:34, I think is the time there. So I didn't spend a terrible amount of time. I started at like 10:17. So I spent like 20 minutes or so on the arms. Yours may take more. Looking at some of these other previous videos, like this fixing other issues video, 10:04 to 10:09. So like really a lot of this is small stuff that I'm doing. Right? So let's look at the play blast of what this looks like after we've splined the arms. Right? Now keep in mind I haven't done any offsetting on the arms. I've just kind of splined them. This also has the retiming in it. And in all honesty, there's still, like, looking at this with fresh eyes, there's still some timing issues I feel like I have with it that I may work on a revision pass. In fact, I may work on this one for the lecture about our revision pass coming up here in a little while. So little things to me, like the jump up onto the tree feels a little poppy. Like I feel like I need to, there's like a frame missing there where a leg kind of pops, and so I need to work on the arcs on that a little bit. Yeah, small foot and weight tweaks. So this is probably where I go in there, and you'll see that some stuff is happening over a single frame, and that's what I'm doing, is kind of making that work a little bit better so I don't get that pop quite as hard anymore. And so the other thing I'm doing is, since I changed the timing, some of the impacts of the steps are feeling a little wrong, and so I'm sort of adjusting the weight to make that feel better. So making that foot slap down a little bit better. I think that this is also a point to trust yourself a little bit, or more like trust future you a little bit. It's very easy to become kind of precious with this and be like, I made all of those decisions in the blocking pass, I can't mess any of that up, right? But like, you're going to be smarter 5 minutes from now than you are right now. Like, and it's not just because I'm teaching. Like, it's that you learn from every one of your steps, right? So trust that version of you, save your file, and feel free to really mess with it, right? If you're like, this pose isn't working, you don't have to live with that just because you thought you were finished with the blocking pass, right? Make it work. Like, you're the person that has to, like, force this thing into functionality. Yes?
There is a tool in the graph editor that if you feel like you've messed up so much, or if you're afraid of messing up too much, where you have to want to save it, back and fix it, there is a tool to save the current curve you have and switch between them.
It's the buffer curves, right?
I think that's what it's called.
I don't remember which of these buttons it is. Is it even in here now, or have they changed the keyframe on it?
I can't see it.
I think it may be one of these two. No, that's the scaling one.
It is right between, it's right beside breaking the tangents.
Oh, these? Yes. So these two buttons right here, what those will let you do is sort of see your before curve as you're editing it, and then you can kind of accept it, like after you've made some changes. So if you don't like the changes you've made, it'll take your curve back to where it was. Yeah.
I was just going to say, like, the only kind of exception to that rule is that if you're doing like 2D frame by frame, you don't want to be spending so much time fixing your animation. It should be cleanup.
Fair enough.
That's more time.
Well, I think more of what I'm saying is, like, you're going to spot things that past you just missed, right? Or that, like, maybe you get a new idea that you're like, oh, you know what, I really need to push this leg longer and have it get there earlier. Like, I'm with you. Like, you once you get it to a certain point, you're like, nope, now it's time to render.
No, you can still do that in 2D rig animation. You can fix your animation to the last minute.
Right. And so, like, I think that it's very easy for us to fall into this, like, I can't mess with it because I might mess it up, right? And that's one of the biggest hurdles to get past after you start getting a little bit more confident in your skill is, like, sometimes it's like you just take a hatchet to it, right? And you just chop chunks out and you just redo that chunk and see if it gets better. If it doesn't, you wasted a little bit of time, but if you save the file, you can always go back to it, right? Okay, so we are at that point now. So this is before I did any of the offsetting, but after I've done all of my splining, right? So this is where it was with no offsetting. And so it looks okay at this point. There's nothing necessarily wrong with it. I feel like there's a couple of small weight things still going on with the feet and the way she runs up the tree. I still kind of feel like there's a little bit of something going on that flip, but let's say that this is where we're at. I have not done an offsetting pass yet, right? I've offset stuff on the individual frame level, but at this point, like, this is just me splining all of my controls from my blocking pass, right? You'll notice on this, like, my keys look very like it's a mess down here on my keys, right? I got keyframes all over the place, so it's not still just everything on the same frames, but I've not shifted entire sections of my model or my animation in order to try to push that overlapping action. So offsetting is where I kind of take what I have and I try offsetting parts of it. So you'll see what I do is I actually just put that head, I dragged it a frame later, right? And I'm testing it to see if it works. Of course, there's going to be little things that may break on that I have to go back and work on when I do. But yeah, so apparently that didn't all work. So just offsetting it all a frame didn't work. What I'm doing instead is I'm shifting parts of it ahead of time and other parts of it back in time, right? And then making sort of some adjustments to that as I go. So this is up the head and the spine, right? So I'm usually doing like at least the top controller of the spine and the head. From there, I'm going to kind of offset down the arms, right? I'm going to have parts of that happen earlier, parts of it happen later. In this case, almost all of it's probably happening later. And you'll see that what I do is select sections and I drag that section later. But some parts I didn't want to mess up my silhouette by changing the frame in which it happened, specifically in the flip. So I didn't offset any of that part. So I'm just offsetting other little parts. And you'll see that I also do a little bit of offsetting on the hand controls and finger controls, right? In order to make that stuff look a little bit better. Yeah. I don't think I make it to the point in this one where I offset the individual fingers. So it's not got that level of polish on it. That would be a level of polish I'd like to put on it. And so doing some last minute changes on the hands. Yeah. And realize that I'm still going back into the curves to make that work better. Okay. So I'd like to show you again the pre-offsetting play blast. And then for comparison purposes, let's look at the one that was offset. So I'll let those, oh, this isn't the, let me open these in different, so we can play them back to back. Okay, so this is before I offset, and this one is after I offset. Yeah, so it should play them back to back, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so let's do that. So this is pre-offsetting is that's no offset, and then this is with the offset. And so it's really small stuff. But it loosens it up. You can kind of tell a little bit that parts of it are just a little springier, a little softer, a little less robotic, right? Particularly her head and I think her arms at the end kind of have a little bit more of a looseness to it, right? As I said, like this is not completely finished. I still see little things in this that I would want to polish on it. And for me, the way, again, that I see those things, the way I find those things I want to polish, is if I step back away from it and watch it, or like if I kind of blur my eyes a little bit or squint my eyes a little bit, little things will pop out to me that that feel off. So really, to me, it's that step right before she jumps, like the one right before she hits the ground. So right there, like right as she's sort of leaping into that last step on the ground. There's something happening there I'm not happy with. I would have to sort of scale that down. I think it's a timing thing. I think it slows down there just a little bit too much. I think there's probably some arcs I could clean up in this. I definitely think that there's some poses I could push even more. Right through the top part of the tree part. Like right through there, I feel like some of that gets a little muddy, partially because her head is so big. And so like some of that I would just sort of change some of the angle of the arm, kind of clear up that silhouette. The other thing that's going to happen is if I render this, I will see other things that make me unhappy. You can't always predict what's going to happen in the render. And so sometimes like your silhouette, like for example, like when she lands here, she kind of has that little like growl face that she's making. But there's no lights and shadows in this, right? And so that may not read as clearly after I render. And so sometimes I render it and I'm like, oh, that could be stronger there. And I have to go change the actual animation to make it look better in the render, right? The other thing that I would say is when you render, render with motion blur on if you can. Motion blur will soften some of the little poppy elements of this. It's called strobing. So if my arm is going to travel a big distance, right, from like way up here to way down here in 2 frames, right, that means there's 1 frame in the middle where my arm is like this, right? And so how that motion is going to look over those 2 frames is pop, 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 right? But if we have a motion blur on this middle one, we won't get that pop through the middle, right? We'll be like up here, it'll smear through the middle and pop into that next frame. So motion blur does help it show a little bit. Is this a 2D? How do you do 2D motion blur? My guess. So you'll still get the same effect in 2D, right? But that's where I think you would put in a little bit of smear frames. You would probably also, you could just soften parts of the body. So if it's that arm smearing down, like maybe repeating lines. If you look at, see if I can find some examples. Image. So some of them, you still have these solid lines around them, but you're just getting this softer feel for the middle. And really what you're doing there is showing multiple, it's like multiple locations of the drawing all in 1 frame, right? Similar here, you're seeing multiple eyes for a character that only has 2 eyes. And what that really does is it allows us to think we're seeing more than 1 frame. The other thing is if you're animating on 2s, fast motions may be a place that you want to animate on 1s just so you don't get that pop feel. And then the other one is something like this, right, where that's a softer frame, right, where you can kind of feather it a little bit by blurring it. Yeah, yeah. And so you can do some effects like that just over that 1 frame. All that's going to kind of depend, yeah, like even like this. Like all that's kind of going to depend on the style of your animation, right? The interesting thing about it, this is actually a kind of a hard one for me, because there's a lot of good 2D renderers for 3D animation. Arnold will do a 2D render really nice, except for Arnold can't tell the difference in pencil lines and fill lines. And so what it does is it blurs your pencil line if you have a pencil line on your 3D object. And so like there's a lot of different ways of interpreting this, and some of that is just sort of a style question. I think there's a lot of different ways of interpreting this in 3D as well. We kind of talked about this, or at least I mentioned this to a few people. Let me pull this back up. I feel like I'm going to Facebook way too often anymore. It's where I'm saving a bunch of animation stuff, though. Let me find it here. So a couple people kind of asked about this. If you look at something like Spider-Verse, here we go. there's some smear frames. We don't need some. There's some smear frames in Spider-Verse that really just feel like a repeated leg. And that's what he's doing here, is he's taking a pose of his animation, right through there, and he's duplicating the mesh in that pose, and then deleting a bunch of polygons from it, right? I say he, this may not, I don't know who it is that did this animation. And then duplicating that mesh to where it's only visible in certain frames, right? And so this is effectively the same thing as a smear frame in 3D. This is something you would do very late in the process. You would do this through, like right before render or something like that. Anybody know Forrest Blaze? He graduated here a couple semesters back. This is something that he did in a couple of animations of his. He had a character that was spinning a spear, and when it was spinning in real time and he rendered it, even with motion blur, it was feeling like it was flickering, right? And so what he did is, while that spear was spinning, he just duplicated it 3 or 4 times and had it appear in multiple places during that spinning. And so this was actually kind of neat. They Photoshop all of his tattoos off just to see what it would look like without tattoos, because people have too much time. But this is better because this is animation and not judging people for tattoos. So anyway, check this out. Like, if this is a way you want to try it, it's just another trick to that. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on in there that, like, when we talk about animation being something that takes a lot of polish time, these are the little things that you're fixing. There's actually a position called Fix Animator. And what that person does is go through and fix that really small stuff, right? Some of you are probably really freaking out because parts of your character's shoulder seem to be blowing through the shirt or something like that, right? Something really small. Ignore that stuff. Like, that's something you fix in that last pass before you render it. I wouldn't even worry about fixing too much of that before we present it for critique. You worry about fixing those things before you put it into your demo reel and apply it to the jobs.
Are those the same people that would fix overseas mistakes in TV shows, or is that a different position?
What do you mean, like?
I know.
Oh, you mean like translation mistakes or something like that, or
like
more like
a mistake in the animation, like when it was sent overseas?
maybe. So you see it a lot in. They also, some people call it a finisher. So you see it a lot in high-end productions, Pixar, Disney, Blue Sky, and stuff like that. And what a lot of times they're doing is that really small stuff, like your character is picking up a water bottle, right? And all of the animation is correct, but you need it to feel like the skin is actually deforming around that bottle. And it's such small stuff that they kind of hire an entry-level somebody to come in there to make those changes, right? You almost don't even notice those things, but if you're doing a really high-level production as a $200 million budget, sure, yeah, it's worth pushing it, I guess. So I don't know about that one. Possibly, I know that we outsourcing has issues kind of built into it, and that sometimes whoever you're outsourcing to isn't in-house, and so like for really small things, it's almost easier to fix those once they get in-house than to send an email and say, hey, can you fix this thing? And then that person may be like, I don't know what you're talking about. This thing? And they're like, no, this thing over here. Oh, okay, I see. And then they fix it, and they're like, almost, fix it again and push it a little bit more. Yeah. At that point, you're like, I could have fixed it in 5 minutes, right?
To send it back.
Right, and so a lot of outsourcing sometimes is used in more of like getting the bulk of the work done, and then we did for Civilization 5 we did a little bit of outsourcing for some of the leaders to 2K Shanghai, and that was sort of one of my jobs once it came back, was to sort of go through the curves, go through the splining, all that one more time, just to make it sort of fit and be a little more cohesive with the rest of the project. And it was like, it'll be 98% of the way there. It was just that last little polish pass to make it cohesive. Also, little things like we were talking about the render issues. For us, it was importing it into a game engine. Sometimes the game engine would do some weird things to it, and we would have to make changes on it just to make the game engine work. So, other questions? Okay. I don't know if this is helpful or discouraging. Hopefully helpful. It's a phrase that I use a lot. I'm sure you all have heard it. You're never finished, right? You just run out of time. Okay. Next class period is out of time, right? And really, that should be encouraging, right? Because like I worked on this shot that we've been looking at like a year ago, and I'm still not finished with it, right? I'll never be finished with it. I just determined that's as far as I'm going to go through. That's as far as I'm going to go on it for this particular example, right? Now, if I decide I want to put this in my demo reel, I'll invest a little bit more time into it and try to get it up to that next level. But you have to accept it's never going to be perfect, right? Because perfect means it's the best you can do. And if that's the best you can do, why keep going, right? Like if you made the perfect animation you'll ever make, why make another one, right? You're going to get better every time, and 2 years down the road, you would be able to revisit this and make it better. I recently revisited stuff that was in my demo reel for years. And I just revisited it to make it a little bit better and to get a better render on it and to get a little bit more, a better cleaned arc pass on it, right? So don't think that there's never really a point where you're done, right? There's a point where you've decided it's time to stop investing in that. Sad story. I recently had to make that decision with the rusty Subaru you all are used to seeing me in. I'm like, you know what? It's time to stop investing money in that. It will now be the car I use if I have to carry something really nasty. Right? If I have to carry a sick baby cow, we'll use that car. But it's the same way. Like it's diminishing returns. You can polish on this piece forever. Try to get it to a point that you are happy with it, right? Recognize that it probably will not be the last time you open that file. So do future you a favor and make sure stuff is labeled correctly and you're able to find the files that you need, right? Okay, any questions? Comments? Okay. You feeling like you got this? I think you got this. I'm actually really happy walking around the room and seeing what you all have been working on. I'm really happy about the progress I think everybody's making. So what I'd like to do, there's nothing due today in terms of homework, but we have the rest of the class till, was it 2:05? Oh, was there something you wanted me to, what was it we were talking about? There was something you said to Gimbal lock. Yeah, it was you. Okay. I remember it was somebody in this class. I was like, who was it? Okay, gimbal lock. Anybody know what that is?
The type of cheese.
It does sound like a delicious cheese, doesn't it?
Isn't it where one of your joints can't rotate or something in a certain direction because something's messed up?
Right. So, think of it this way. We have three axes, right? We have our x-axis, our y-axis, and then our z-axis that goes up this way, right? Let's just take x and y, right? These two here, right? And they're sort of crisscrossing, right? If you have to rotate y 90 degrees, well, now it's the same as x, right? And that means now you don't have a way of rotating in y. That can be really frustrating, right? So you will run into this sometimes. It's nothing you're doing wrong. Whenever you create a rig, because of the way rigging works, there's no real way of eliminating any chance that gimbal lock will happen. What usually happens is a rigging artist sets up a rig and says, these are the axes that you're most likely to rotate your character in, right? So for example, you bring in your character, they're like, well, they're going to need the character to lean forward and back. Most likely, that's the axis they're going to be using the most, right? And they're going to need the character to lean side to side while they're talking. That's the one they're going to use the most. Less frequently, you're going to have to animate your character twirling all the way around in a circle multiple times, right? It happens sometimes, but it's less frequent. So what they say is evaluate that curve last, okay? And so it'll evaluate the X curve and then the Y curve, but then when it comes to the Z curve, that's the last one it calculates. And so the one that it calculates last is the one that is most likely to get you into gimbal lock, right? Now what gimbal lock really means though is you can rotate your character in that axis, but the curves are not going to make sense. Like if I'm using me as the example instead of this arm thing, right? If I rotate, this is this axis, this is this axis. If I rotate 90 degrees to point toward that door, then now these are my two axes, right? And so that axis, when I rotate my Y or my X, I'm going to get this, right? No, wrong way. I'm going to get this, right? And I'm not going to have the ability to get this anymore. Does that make sense? It may make more sense if I show you in mine. So anyway, you're going to run into that. There are ways of working around that. There's no real way of fixing that. That Euler filter that I showed you all earlier will help, but it won't completely fix it. So let's use this box as an example here. So, I gotta wait for that thing to pop up, don't I? So, let's make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. If I hold down E and click on this, you'll see that there's a couple of different ways I can look at this. I can look at the object, the world, and there's also component and gimbal, right? Well, let's go ahead and leave it in object mode right now. And you'll see that if I rotate on my Y-axis, all of those axes kind of go with it, right? So we have X right here that I adjust, right? And then we have, if I rotate my Y, now my X is just pointed this way, right? But if I go back to this and look at gimbal, this is just a different way of looking at those same axes, right? And so watch what happens now if I rotate on my Y. Well, now my X and my Z are aligned, right? And if I need that box to rotate from side to side, I don't have a curve to grab anymore, right? So that means in your graph editor, you can still rotate this thing. It's not broken forever. But in the graph editor, I would rotate this, but my curves are going to really generate possibly incorrectly. And you're not just going to have one curve that you can edit that will fix that side-to-side motion. You may have two curves that are changing drastically different in order to get that. That ends up causing like this little wobble to happen, right? And it makes it a little harder to edit within the graph editor. Again, there's no real way of fixing it. Sometimes what you have to do is where you have that wobble, you have to just set a lot of keyframes and change it manually on every frame, right? Some rigs have an additional controller for everything. Anybody using the, is it the Malcolm rig? Or maybe it's the, I don't remember which rig it is. It's the one from Anim School, I think. It has like 3 controls for everything. Like 3 rib controls, 3 like head controls, whatever it is. Maybe that is Malcolm. And that's so if one of them gets in gimbal lock, you'll just stop animating on that one and start animating on the other one, right? There's multiple ways of animating the same thing. Other ways you can fix this is possibly using animation layers. We'll be talking about animation a little bit later, or animation layers a little bit later, but if you run into this issue, I can help you work through it, but sometimes it's just, you have to do it brute force. You have to move it and make it do exactly what you want it to do every frame. So that was a question that Elijah had. Anybody else have any specific questions about specific things you're running into? All right. Okay, well, I'm going to be quiet now. What I would do is go ahead and tell you, like, at least for the next 15 minutes or so, I will go ahead and give you the opportunity to hop around, meet up with your groups, get some feedback from them if you want to. It can be quick meetings if you have stuff to see. This is sort of the last time you're going to be meeting in this classroom before Project 1 is due. So this is a good time to get that last pass of feedback. Again, I'm not taking up anything, so it's just meeting with people and chatting with them if you'd like to. So, all right. Oh, yes.
After we get done with groups, can I get your help on something?
Yes, and I'll be around the rest of the class. I can bounce around and help y'all how you want to. So, all right, rest of the class is yours. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the video and upload it.